Hi everyone, thank you for joining this special live screening and discussion organized by Stand with Kashmir and the People's Forum on the award winning short documentary Out of Sight, which follows a young pellet victim survivor in Kashmir. My name is Mir Fatima Kant. I'm a graduate student in anthropology and the moderator for this discussion. I'm honored to be in conversation with our four speakers today, who will share their experiences of making this documentary and expert comments on the use of violent technologies by modern state power for the purposes of maiming. We're joined by Professor Jasbir Paur, Professor and Graduate Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University, where she has been a faculty member since 2000. Her most recent book is The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, published with Duke University Press in the series ANIMA, Critical Race Studies Otherwise, that she co-edits with Mel Chen. Professor Paur is the author of award-winning Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, which has been translated into Spanish and French and reissued in an expanded version for its 10th anniversary. From the team, we have with us three speakers. First, Azad Essa, who's a senior reporter for the Middle East Eye based in the greater NYC area. He has reported from across the African continent as well as South Asia, covering politics, development, and poverty. In 2018, he was a visiting fellow at the Neiman Foundation. Out of Sight is his first short documentary. Our second speaker is Horia Haddad, a filmmaker and documentary producer at Al Jazeera English, based in Doha. Horia's most recent films are A Marrakesh Tale, Paris, Voice of the Suburbs, When Time Stopped at Sea, East End Undertakers, Undocumented and Under Attack, and Out of Sight in Kashmir. She is currently working on her first feature film based in Syria. Our fourth speaker is Rifat, a journalist and filmmaker based in Kashmir. She is the producer of Out of Sight, Al Jazeera's film on Kashmir's teenage pellet victim survivors. She writes on human rights, children, and women in the region. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you for joining this discussion today. Before we move on to our panel discussion, we'll first screen the documentary on YouTube. We encourage our viewers to participate in the discussion through comments on our YouTube live stream.
कूदस में दोप ना थोड़ा पाक मगर बह हेक्स पकित बह पे पे अथी गोचस मज पत्थर पे पाई बह कित कन वात हस्पताल मे पे हस्पताल यल गई मे वो अन गोट तन पे पे सारे खौफ पत यु मे पैलेट आए मे गो मतलब मे लोग शौक पन्नी जाए यह क्या गो मे गोड पाई पैलेट वैलेट क्या गो कि मतलब अतन नबर कन वन सारे खौफ वन मतलब बेहवान नबर कन वन बेहवान क्या तमिस दपान क्या पता अगर अस त लगान अस त मा सोचे पे आज गोस बह पगह गस ब्या यम लोग शौक यु मे दोप कि मे अथ कहें पे गो मुश्किल पन्न जाए
बथिस ज्यादा पूरा बथिस
मतलब बेन क्या माजे स्ट्रेस کیٛازِ سۄ تہِ آسہِ سونٛچان وقتَس کہِ مےٚ تہِ اوس نیٚچوٗ اَسان گِنٛدان باقٕیَن سۭتۍ اوس باقٕیَن ہِنٛدی پٲٹھۍ روزان کہِ وۄنۍ چھُنہٕ یہِ تیُتھ کینٛہہ تَمہِ کہِ وجہ سۭتۍ آسہِ سٹرٛٮ۪س
یہِ اوس اَصٕل پٲٹھۍ أمِس یَنہٕ آے وۄنۍ برٛینَس یا أچھَن آیَس تَنہٕ ہیوٚت أمِس زیادٕ تیزَر کَرُن أمِس پیوٚو برٛینَس دَوا تَمہِ سۭتۍ اوس یہِ تھوڑا گژھان پَتہٕ اوس یہِ بیٚیہِ کَران تی تیوٗتاہ چھُ اِنسان تنٛگ یِوان دَپان چھُ گَرٕ بار ترٛاوو وۄنۍ نیرو ژَلو أسی سُہ گوٚو ؤسۍ سُہ چھُ طوٗفان آمتُے سُہ چھُ واریاہ بوٚڑ تٔمۍ کٔرۍ أسۍ واریاہ توتہِ مٲلۍ سُنٛد چھُ آسان اکھ ساے اکھ أکِس بَچَس اگر اکھ کٲم اوس کَران بہٕ ٲسٕس بیٛاکھ کَران توتہِ ٲس تٔمۍ سٕنٛز نظر گُزر أمِس پٮ۪ٹھ روزان تٔمۍ ژھُن أسۍ تٔمۍ کٔرۍ أسۍ تٔمۍ ژھٕنۍ أسۍ سٲنۍ ناوٕے ڈُبٲوِتھ اَسہِ روٗد نہٕ کانٛہہ تہِ سہارٕ اَسہِ اوس سہارٕ سُے کیٛاہ نا تیٚلہِ وۄنۍ واتہِ ہا دُکانَس بیٚہکھ نا وٕنۍ تام وۄنۍ آز وانٕے کوٚر ژےٚ
مول تہِ روٗد نہٕ بٕڈِبب تہِ روٗد نہٕ کینٛہہ وۄنۍ چھِ گرٕ تہِ مے پَکناوان
ڈِفکَلٹی چھِ یِوان اگر مےٚ کٲنٛسہِ وَنان سودا دِ وۄنۍ چھِ آسان تٔمِس پونٛسہٕ مےٚ چھِنہٕ آسان پَیی پونٛسہٕ کوٗتاہ چھِ پَتہٕ چھِ مےٚ پٮ۪وان لٮ۪نسہٕ سۭتۍ تہِ چھِنہٕ گۄڈٕ وارٕ مےٚ کوٗتاہ چھِ واپَس دیُن بیٚیہِ چھِ مےٚ منٛزٕ اَدلہٕ بدل گژھان چیٖز مےٚ اوس نہٕ زانٛہہ سوٗنٛچمُت کہِ بہٕ چلاوان یہِ دُکان مےٚ اوس پَتہٕ بہٕ کَرٕ کینٛہہ نَتہٕ بدل کینٛہہ کٲم اَصٕل کینٛہہ کٲم
مطلب بہٕ اوسَکھ پانَس سۭتۍ باقٕے تہِ نِوان وۄنۍ گوٚو اَتھ یہِ چینٛج کہِ وٕنکٮ۪نَس چھُس بہٕ باقٕیَن پٮ۪ٹھ ڈِپٮ۪نٛڈ وٕنکٮ۪س چھِ مےٚ نِوان پانَس سۭتۍ تھَپھ کٔرِتھ
کَرییَکھ مےٚ وٕنیُک تام واریاہ آپریشَن مےٚ اوس آسان ڈیٹ کُنہِ وِزِ چَک اَپ خٲطرٕ بہٕ اوسُس گژھان تور چَک اَپ خٲطرٕ پَتہٕ دوٚپ یِمو آپریشَن کَروے ہٮ۪کوے نہٕ ژےٚ وۄنۍ کٔرِتھ کینٛہہ اَتھ چھِ رِسٕک اَتھ ہیٚکہِ لٮ۪نٕس پھٕٹِتھ پَتہٕ ہیٚکہِ نہٕ گاش روٗزِتھ کِہیٖنۍ
زنٛگہِ نَرِ گژھِ لوٚنٛگ لوٚنٛگ کَران پَکو یا نٔر ؤٹِتھ پَکو مگر أچھَن ہُنٛد چھُ سورُے چھُ أتھۍ پٮ۪ٹھ یِتھ کٔنۍ نَلکُک آب چھُ ضوٚرَتھ یِتھ کٔنۍ أچھَن ہِنٛز بیٖنٲیی وۄنۍ چھُ رۄبہٕ کٔریٖمَے دی بیٚیہِ تٔمِس تام چھُ سورُے
بہٕ حظ چھُس چاہان بہٕ گٔیَس تہِ اَتھ چھِنا وۄنۍ نیٚبرٕ لایان کٲشرٮ۪ن بہٕ حظ کھوٗژُس گَرِکیو دوٚپ پَتہٕ وَن لٲنَے ژےٚ زیادَے ژٕ چھُکھ پیلَٹُک تِم تہِ پَتہٕ کَرنَے ژےٚ زیادَے تَتہِ اسی لیے گوٚژھ نہٕ وۄنۍ کِہیٖنۍ بہٕ اوسُس پانہٕ توتہِ وٕچھِ بہٕ تَتہِ کیٛاہ وَنان تَتہِ اگر دَپہٕ ہن ژٕ گژھکھ ٹھیٖک سُہ اوس بہتر وۄنۍ گٔے اَتھ حالات خراب تَتہِ چھِ لایان اسی لیے گوٚژھ نہٕ وۄنۍ کِہیٖنۍ
کیٛازِکہِ اگر ییٚتہِ یِتھَے کٔنۍ روزِ ییٚتہِ مۄکلہِ پاپلیشَن سٲرٕے پَتہٕ نہ روزِ سون ناو نہ کینٛہہ یہِ چھِنہٕ شرارت یہِ چھِ سون حق
से तुरु क्यों जाना दिया अब तो सके नार में खाया तो खाया ये शो como te hacen que ya तो सब पावरी गोमो का तो का का मांझे
मतलब बस न यथान कि मे गस बह मंग कंस कह वनकस बह दपान बह कर मगर मे गोडनिची कत बह हेक मे पा बह हेक कर मतलब अंदर मे मगर दपान दिल च गस च कर ट्राई क्या हम हारन कह
Farzan leaves us with some powerful words there at the end. I want to start with you first, Azad. Can you tell us about the conceptualization of the film in terms of how and why you decided to work on the story of a pellet victim survivor in Kashmir and how you guys decided to cover it?
Hi, Fatima. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the People's Forum and Stanford Kashmir for putting together this panel. I guess for starters, I want to say that the short film is just a modest attempt to take the story about how Kashmiris have been impacted by these pellets, as far as wide as possible. And like Farzan, there are thousands of Kashmiris who have been injured by pellets in some form or another. And there are journalists in Kashmir like Rifat who have been trying their best to tell these stories. And it's only because of those stories on the ground and in local media that we were able to find Farzan. I say this by way of introduction because Kashmiri journalists are finding it harder and harder to work these days, which means that getting these types of intimate stories are becoming harder to commission and arrange by the day. And it was very difficult to shoot this, and I cannot imagine the conditions today. So I think that's an important starting point. In terms of my interest in the story, I think we have to go back to 2011 when I met a young man named Amir in Baramulla, a town in, you could say, northern Kashmir that straddles the Jhelum River. And Amir had lost all his eyesight after being hit with pellets some months earlier in 2010, during the uprising in 2010. And I was given copies of his x-rays and his medical report. And I was urged to write about this new tactic that was being used. But I sort of had never come across pellets before. And getting Kashmiri stories into the international media was hard enough. And so little information available about pellets, I kind of put it by the wayside. And I decided that once I understood the story a bit better and this issue of pellets, I would explore it at a later date. And I actually still have his x-rays and the interviews from 2011. Now, fast forward to 2016, excuse me, when Indian troops started using these shotguns en masse, almost as a primary form of crowd control. They would spray these lead-based pellets into the crowds, often indiscriminately, and hundreds of people would get injured or maimed or blinded by these small lead-based pellets. And so, because so many people were being injured in 2016, the news started, making the rounds and we started finding out more about the ways in which they were being used. So when I began following the protests in 2016, I began, following how young protesters were being maimed and blinded, and sort of like watching the utter contempt with which they were being treated. And what was becoming clear was that, this was an attempt to permanently sort of punish them for demonstrating dissent against Indian rule. And for me, as a reporter looking in, for me, this became the very embodiment of what Kashmiris described as the Indian occupation. It was a kind of ownership of and experimentation on the Kashmiri body. I kept on returning, in my mind, I kept on returning to this first meeting with Amir, and I remembered how depressed he looked. And at the time in 2010, how little was known about pellets, and therefore how little could be done to help him, And I saw the strain he was taking on the family, and I saw how the community also looked at him. So it wasn't just a case of being shot with pellets and being injured. It was also about a scar that marks you, and so you were permanently marked by this thing. And so through 2016 and 2018, these 2 years, it became a personal project, to follow the story. And I spoke to doctors, I followed the incidents, I spoke to human rights experts. And going back to that 2011 meeting, I kept on looking for an opportunity to go beyond the incident itself and explore the aftermath. So Farzan's story is about the aftermath, because protesters are hurt, it becomes news, they are marked, and then they are forgotten. So in terms of, the storyline, when I had some time in 2018, I wanted to, build a team in which we could tell a story about the aftermath of a survivor of this. And I sought advice, about what type of story we should tell. And we decided on two things. And the first one is that it should be an intimate, personal story. And the second thing was that it should be a story that doesn't whitewash the reality and suggest that it was some type of mistake. No, this is not a mistake. And this character, that we would choose would hopefully reflect this meta narrative. Something horrific is going down in Kashmir. And while he would talk for himself, his story would speak for others, basically.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit more about, from your experiences of reporting on the region and from the ground, an overview of the use of these shotguns as a measure of crowd control?
Sure. I like that you call them shotguns because, they're not pellet guns. They aren't toys. These are pump action shotguns that shoot lead-based pellets. These weapons are made by the Ordnance Factory, a huge arms manufacturing company operating under India's Department of Defense. The company has huge deals with countries in Europe, in the US, Turkey, and others, which is something I think people should look into. The pellet guns that the Indian forces use in Kashmir, they have a couple of different types, but the cartridges are either 300 or 600 pellets of just around 3 millimeters each, or just under 3 millimeters each pellet. And so these are described as non-lethal weapons or like methods of crowd control. But even this flagrantly false description is incumbent on you using it from a distance of 50 meters or more from crowds of people. So these pellets are shot out of the shotguns, right? And they come out in clusters. So when they are shot out, they first travel in a cluster and then they disperse over that distance. So it's sold as if it will hurt, but it won't maim. Now, it's a ridiculous idea, but anyway, Indian forces have been using this inappropriate weapon in a very seriously dangerous way by mostly shooting them at close range and firing them indiscriminately, into the air. So, and the proof of this is that most people who have been hit by the pellets have been hit by, they find cluster of pellets in them, which means that they were shot at close range, and meaning that the pellets were not able to disperse. And second proof of this is that many Kashmiris injured by the pellets have been injured in the face, which means that not only are they shooting these cartridges close up, but they're firing indiscriminately, upwards. So in 2016, for instance, 25% of those hit by pellets in Kashmir were hit in the face. So this means that there are young people in Kashmir with pellets lodged in their skull, in their throat, the back of their gums. Now, in terms of impact, right? What is important to know is that doctors in Kashmir have had very little literature to refer to when dealing with these cases. So they have had to sort of deal with these pellets on a case-by-case basis, innovating faucets, to pull out these pellets, and trying to find out quickly, that these pellets are actually very difficult to remove and very dangerous. Because these pellets also, because they are lead-based, they can't use magnetic forms to pull them out. So imagine being in a conflict zone and not being able to deal with a weapon that you don't even understand. And finally, Farzan says that when he is in the sun for too long, his head begins to heat up inside. So, these pellets are lodged into his head. And so this has long-lasting and untold sort of trauma on those who are hit by it.
Thank you for that overview, Azad. I want to turn to Rifat now to focus on the process of making this film on Kashmir. Rifat, so this particular story of Farzan, what compelled you about this particular story, and what did it take to develop a relationship with the family to be able to comment on the struggles of pellet victim survivors in Kashmir?
Thank you, Fatima. Actually, Farzan, like when we went to meet Farzan first time, like gradually like we met him. He was very young. He was like someone who had a lot of dreams. He was someone who wanted to do a lot of things in life, and he was someone who was also very passionate, very aggressive at times. But I think Farzan's story is very important because Farzan's case was something which was a story of struggle, hope, and story of an everyday battle. And Farzan is like he's a teenager, and in those like 2 years he was hit with like pellets twice, like once in his left eye, and then once again next year he was hit on his face, head, chin. And I think in his story there was an extraordinary struggle, because while Farzan was like being treated for his injuries, while he was like waiting for his surgeries, while he was struggling with all the trauma, he had to like drop his studies for time being because he was very busy with treatment. His family suffered a lot, and on the way his like father fell sick, he was like their support, who was supporting Farzan, who was supporting family. And like after a brief struggle at hospital, his father died. So suddenly Farzan found himself burdened with all those things, and he kind of had to forget, like he had a lot of surgeries to wait for, he was fighting for his eyesight. And when like gradually we started spending a lot of time with Farzan, we started spending time with his mother. I remember like, when I went once, like it was only fourth day when his father had died. I actually I was like following this story for a lot of time. Then when I suddenly went one day, I heard that his father had died. I was like already doing a little bit of research on him. So what I had in mind, the story suddenly changed, because I didn't have an idea that his father is very sick, and Farzan will suddenly lose his father as well. And Farzan's story is like, it's a story of struggle of all those young men like who are maimed with pellets. Because Farzan's story, like we followed it for months together, it tells you that it does not end with like losing an eyesight. It does not end with an individual. It does not end with a person who is like who loses his eyesight and who gets injured and who has a surgery to wait for, who has a struggle to wait for a turn in the hospital. The whole idea is to tell the personal story of an individual. Because when you see Farzan's story, it is story of the whole family. It does not only end with Farzan. It does not only involve Farzan. It involves the whole family. And similarly, when we look at all those pellet victims who have been hit, it adds thousands of more people with them, because it adds their families, it adds their parents. It kind of collapses their whole family structure. Because when we were like following the film and we were spending time with the family, and suddenly it becomes it was like a kind of emotional struggle for us as well, because daily we were witnessing him. Sometimes he would get aggressive with his mother, sometimes his mother would lose control. It's like it was not just it was not just his fight, like to kind of get his himself treated. It added all the other battles, like he didn't want, for instance, he didn't want to run a shop. He didn't imagine that he would have to run that shop that his father was running. He kind of had big dreams for himself. All the young people have in their life, like he wanted to get educated, he wanted to do better. But suddenly when he found himself in the middle of all this, because he cannot see, he cannot walk all by himself. And then it kind of added a mental trauma to him. It kind of added to all the other issues for him. But one more thing is that it was not easy to, like, for example, to shoot the film then, because when I remember when we were like supposed to send the footage and all, there was no internet. For us as well, it was a very lengthy process, very like tiring, very hard.
Thank you for that, Rifat. Actually, I wanted to move to the next part of the conversation to think more on what were the challenges of filmmaking on the ground. I know you spoke a little bit about internet, but could you speak to us a little more on the various other kinds of challenges that the team might have faced while filming on the ground in Kashmir, and especially in the conditions in the last few years?
I think, yeah, we like there are a lot of struggles when you are a journalist in Kashmir. You kind of prepare yourself for all those struggles. But like the major struggle was like for us was the internet, because last year certainly, like in past years, if we see, like there has been internet shutdown in Kashmir in 2016 or after that, whenever there was a like sensitive situation or unrest, civilian uprising. But in August 5, it was an unprecedented situation. It was an extraordinary situation. In the past, people or journalists or filmmakers or professionals, like they would navigate a gap. Like if the mobile internet was shut, there was something else which we could access. There was a phone, like we could make a call, or there was some other thing we could manage. But last time, like the communication blockade was totally, journalists or everyone found themselves like we had no option. And I think for us, we took on all the struggles while shooting the film, like while it took a lot of time, it took a lot of energy. And like I know it was a very small effort, a very this to tell, because till now what we had seen, we because pellet injury has now become a figure. You will read newspapers that okay, 10 are like hit with pellets, 5 are injured with pellets, like even girls were injured with pellets. So I think when we told the Farzan story, pellet injury had become just a figure, it had become a photograph. But I think through Farzan's story, we tried to tell, like, the very close life of a pellet victim, the very intimate life of a pellet victim, the everyday struggle of a pellet victim. I think it's very important for people to know, because if we see, there is this pellet association where all these pellet victims have come together. People should know it, because in a way they have come together to support each other. And each and every one in that aspect must be going through all, the struggle that Farzan goes through. And it makes every story, it makes it different, powerful, and it makes it, very emotional as well. So coming back to this part of internet, I think the last year that was the major problem we faced, because when we had to set the footage and all, when we had to work on like our footage and videos, the internet was the major hurdle that we came across.
Thank you for that insight. That's really important to think about the everyday struggles that pellet victim survivors face in Kashmir, because in the larger context, we often forget that the everyday is also a side of struggle for so many communities. Uh, Moving on to Horia, I have broader questions about, can you give us some more insight into the evolution of the project, how the project evolved over different stages, and how the character of Azan spoke to you?
Okay, hi Fatima. Yes, when Azad first reached out and said he's got all this incredible material from Kashmir, I was really interested to just get my hands on it and review it and just see what kind of material he had. That's mostly because, particularly in television, everyone knows it's just so difficult to get material out of Kashmir. And particularly material relating to such personal stories. So once I did have a chance to review all the material, I was really pleasantly surprised by the strength of the material, really. And I think that's testament to Rifat's effort that she put in with Farzan over all those months and building that relationship with him. You know, watching some of the footage, it's magic. It's like you're there in the living room with the family. And that's only due to the efforts of Rifat and her team. So I immediately knew that this material was really special, and you know I really wanted to help Azad, you know, and see if we could work on something and produce something quite special together. So I would say the evolution of the project was really just kind of, you know, getting our eyes on the material, figuring out what material there was and what we could do with that material, and then kind of just going from there. So I remember looking at the footage, reviewing it, and thinking, okay, well, this material will make up this scene and this will make up this scene, but actually this is just one clip. And although what he's saying is really important and special, like we don't have those elements to build up a scene, because we decided, you know, in keeping with such an intimate kind of portrait of Farzan, we wanted to make this documentary in the observational documentary style. So with observational documentary, we need various elements to build up a scene. You know, it's not necessarily just an interview. You know, there are shots of, you know, someone opening the door. Like it's kind of sequence driven, like an action sequence of observational style. So the first thing we did was just, you know, in the edit, just put down all the material that we thought could build a story. And then the second phase of that was for Azad and I to discuss, you know, what elements we thought was missing. So, I mean, the general thread of that story was, you know, like the basic thing is, okay, 18-year-old Farzan, you know, is a pellet victim and he's coming to terms with the loss of his eyesight. So how do we build that story around, you know? So that's how we decided to go for a second shoot and see if we can build more scenes into that and just kind of, you know, pad that story out a bit.
I know you spoke a little bit about reshooting the scenes, but could we get some more insight into what it took, the kind of effort and the kind of, because I know this communication was happening with the team based in 3 countries and trying to then come together to reshoot the scenes. What were some of the considerations in terms of telling the story? You know, like I know you said it being an observational documentary style, but what were some of the considerations that you had after you received the content?
So one of the biggest considerations was the fact that part of the footage was filmed in summer and part of it was filmed in winter. So already, you know, for a short documentary, you know, we just had to make sure that, you know, far from misleading anyone, but just for it not to be such a drastic difference. So we shot scenes inside, indoors. And also a big part of that was also going back to the interview, seeing what their most strongest sound bites were and kind of building scenes around that, you know? So for whatever they say, we want like the footage and what we're seeing to complement that. For example, the scene with his father, or him looking at the photographs of his father at home, you know, this was a big part of why Farzan was so angry and why he was going through, you know, so much hardship. You know, not only has he lost his eyesight, but he's doing so, you know, amidst the loss of a father and also having to step up as the main breadwinner of a family. That's a lot for an 18-year-old to deal with. So it was about kind of capturing those scenes that would help tell that story visually rather than just saying it.
Thank you for that insight. Before we bring in Jasbir to talk about structures of impunity and abuse, it's a question for the whole team. Whoever would like to answer it would be great. There's a scene in the movie which is where Farzan talks about space, the outside space, and this outside space and this everyday becoming a site of fear, because he's saying that we were all hanging out in that outside space, perhaps outside the house, on the street, outside the shop front, where all the friends would gather. But then he talks about this fear of the outside. And I thought that very nicely ties into this comment on the everyday and this fear of the pellets. But the everyday also becomes a site of fear. So was that deliberate, like in terms of that being placed or that being a part of it, because that is a lived reality for this big community of pellet victim survivors?
Sorry, was that to me? Sorry, it cut out. Oh, to everyone. Okay.
Oh, it's for the whole team, whoever would like to answer it.
Okay, I'll answer it. I think what he meant, because in the locality where Farzan lives, there's like the boys are used to go out in the evening, chill out in the evening, sit on the shop fronts and talk to each other. I think he meant to say is like after his situation, like I think it was just what he said. It was very natural what came out of him. He meant to say that when they used to chat, they used to enjoy outside, they used to sit outside after his situation, because his friends are like they are much aware, they know and they see and they witness his struggle every day. And when they see him, they kind of get scared, they fear that situation might return to them. And it also talks about, if we go deep down into it, it also talks about the kind of struggle, it scares the other person. It scares the other person. See if it happens to you, how miserable or how difficult or how tough your life will become. So he maybe he might be having those conversations with his friends, who might be, because sometimes they help him to walk, they hold his hand, sometimes they help him in the shop, sometimes they help him to count the money in the shop. So I think that's what he tried to kind of describe his struggle to his friends.
We have an audience question on the specifics of the documentary, where someone's asking, how can we support Farhan and other victims of pellet gun injuries in Kashmir? Azad or Rifat, do you want to answer that?
Well, the problem is that, as you know, Fatima, sending money to Kashmir is not that simple. So, there's these bans on foreign, foreign donations, etc. So, I think if they want to assist, they can get in touch with us privately, and we can explain to them if they want to, help out if it comes to income, if they want to help out when it comes to other kinds of resources, then we can direct them to the people who can facilitate that. But no, just sending money to the association for the pellet victims is not possible from outside. And so, yeah, you can chat to us, and you can talk to me, you can talk to Rifat, and we can give you some ideas of what can be done.
All right, thank you, Azad. Zooming out of the specifics of the documentary, I want to bring in Jasbir here. In your recent work, Right to Maim, you compare structures of abuse and impunity across the US and Israel-Palestine, and foreground the concept of debility through sanctioned processes of maiming. Given how pellet shotguns are deemed as non-lethal weapons for crowd control in Kashmir by the state, how do you see this fitting into the global network of maiming and debility by imperialist states?
Thanks for that question. It's an honor to be here. I just wanted to thank the People's Forum and also Stand With Kashmir for including me. And I've already learned so much from this discussion already, and I'm kind of hearing the resonances with Palestine, but also the differences as well. And this, I think this is a really important conversation in part to start having or to be having, because it's so crucial to kind of de-exceptionalize Palestine in particular, where the scene of maiming has become a kind of media spectacle in some sense, right? Globally speaking. And so just one question I'm interested in hearing everyone talk about is, how certain scenes or theaters of maiming garner more concern than others. I think Azad was just pointing to the way a humanitarian aid economy can or cannot cohere around certain political situations. So I'm really interested in that. There's also something to be said about targeting the eyes versus targeting the legs, which is what's happening in Gaza, and both are happening in Palestine. But the focus since the first Intifada has really been about the break their bones policy that Yitzhak Rabin put into place during the first Intifada. And so in terms of the question of impunity, I think that, there is a humanitarian aid economy around Palestine that understands what's happening, for example, in Gaza as a humanitarian crisis, as a disaster, as opposed to a liberation movement. And so there's that kind of depoliticization going on that allows for a particular version of disaster capitalism to take hold, as opposed to looking at the kind of political repression that's going on. But one of the ways I wanted to just highlight, in terms of a kind of global network of thinking about maiming, and again, as I've kind of talked a little bit about this, but the usage of this term non-lethal. And we can also talk about this term crowd control as well. So in the United States, we have been having this conversation about the quote unquote non-lethal status of rubber bullets in regards to maiming journalists, of medics and protesters, several of them in the eyes now. And it's also the case that, there's a claim to be using non-lethal weaponry in Palestine as a way of minimizing the violence and the kind of the brutality of unleashing this kind of targeting on protesters. And it's important, and it's important to note that the distinction between lethal and non-lethal weaponry is, functions primarily as a kind of legal distinction, right? It's not necessarily, as all of you have been pointing out, it's not necessarily related to the kind of suffering or the kind of bodily harm that's done. And what that does is organize a narrative spatially and temporally, right? It keeps our attention on the distinction between life and death, so that we don't pay as much attention to the kind of hinge between injury and death, which is what you're all talking about. And I think this hinge between injury and death is part of where the impunity comes from. It gets hidden. We ask fewer questions about what happens to those who are injured. And that's why I found the film so incredibly powerful. This distinction also organizes the event of the injury so that the before and the after the injury is effaced. So, I'd be interested in hearing more about in Kashmir what the medical infrastructure is like, but what does it mean to use quote unquote non-lethal weaponry in a place like Gaza, where the medical infrastructure is so decimated that non-lethal injuries can become, if not lethal, they certainly can become what's called in Palestine a permanent injury, right? And so this is where the framing of debility and debilitation really matters. So the afterlife or life trajectory of maiming, which Azad spoke about, injury outlasts news cycles, right? Which is what Rifat was talking about. And the question of repeat injuries and everyday struggles is really important. And then there are also, kind of less known sub-distinctions of like less lethal, less than lethal, non-deadly, non-pain inducing. So, so there are all of these subdivisions around that particular binary that that is kind of bought into. So for example, tear gas is quote unquote non-lethal, but the effects of long-term exposure to tear gas could count as less than lethal rather than legitimately non-lethal, right? So the distinction being managed here in this legal framing between lethal and non-lethal is actually a temporal one. It's like, what's, you know, how, to be quite crude about it, like how soon do you die from this particular, you know, event of injury? So those are some of the thoughts I had about how to kind of connect some of these conversations.
Drawing upon what you just explained in terms of it hinging between injury and death, I want to know a little bit more about, you know, in your book, you talk about that ever since the book has come out, we're at a time when the conversation on disability rights, resources, and modes of care have expanded. And you would, I guess, going with the book, you would categorize these forms of non-lethal weaponry under the label of sanctioned maiming, which you explained is somehow seen as more humanitarian because it doesn't kill, it only injures. Could you tell us more about this conceptualization of settler colonial states deliberately disallowing death and prolonging this idea of death?
Yeah, the book really is interested in thinking about, you know, what is the relationship between precisely, you know, Fatima, as you're kind of framing it, the relationship between the increasing visibility and rise and entrenching of disability rights platforms globally on one hand, and then, you know, what we're seeing, which is increasing visibility of the sovereign right to maim, right? And so I'm kind of interested in the periodization that Azad was talking about from 2010 on, you know, this in Gaza, you know, the 2014 siege of Gaza, war on Gaza was really focalized around civilian deaths. And so what people didn't see or kind of realize is that 10,000 people were disabled in that war and continue to live with disabilities or permanent injuries in particular kinds of ways. But what's been going on recently in Gaza has just been this like full on unleashing. And so that kind of sovereign right to maim, which is, it has had a kind of, you know, foil through humanitarian aid discourses of at least we didn't kill you. And in terms of the Great March of Return, the understanding that all protesters are legitimate targets because they're all with Hamas or they're all terrorists, this kind of thing. But I think we are seeing less of a, it's a question, do these states need impunity anymore? Or is there a kind of completely unleashed, you know, spectacle of the right to maim that's being kind of globally sanctioned by international communities? So in the book, I was really thinking about this kind of letting live as always a kind of gift, and the assumption that that letting live is always, you know, is better than a kind of right to kill or the making die quadrant. But now I'm also wondering about the kind of out and out permission that states give themselves to actually just target without any kind of explanation or any recourse to these humanitarian aid discourse, humanitarian aid frames. So I'm interested in thinking about how this is progressing, even as the kind of disability rights frames become more, you know, popularized as a way to address disability, and also whether that has any presence in Kashmir also, because in Palestine, there's a kind of very vast NGO network that's kind of constantly attending to the injuries and the collateral damage of the occupation. And so I was, you know, not sure if that's applicable in any way to Kashmir in the same way.
Thank you, Jasbir. We'll draw upon those questions in a little while. We have some audience questions, and maybe you can answer this one. This question asks, what percentage of pellet gun injuries lead to serious injuries, if not all? What do international laws say about the use of pellets?
Sorry, is that for me?
Yeah.
So I would know less about. I wonder if Azad might know a little bit more about that. I would know less about pellet guns or pellet bullets in particular, actually. And in terms of injury, I can speak to Gaza. You know that in the last 2 years of the Great March, almost 2.5 years now, there's been more than 30,000 injuries, and more than 7,000 of them have involved injury to the lower limb. Again, it's almost, if we talk about percentages of how many, what's the percentage of injury, but this, going back to Rifat's point, like these are usually kind of accumulation of injuries, right? There's kind of multiple injuries that are kind of generationally as well as within one generational sustained. So it's complicated to think about what's the percentage.
Okay. Azad, I want to redirect this question to you because the question brings up this interesting point about what do international laws say about the use of pellets?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I would like to just respond to Jasbir's initial point. I think it's important to just go back to this question of binaries and the kind of non-lethal weapons that are also used in Kashmir. So for instance, they use tear gas, they use this chili gas as well, and they use pellets. Now, I think in 2010, more than 110 or 120 young people were killed during the uprising that took place in 2010, and they were shot, right? And so this pellets, this use of pellets came as a result of an attempt to sort of like move away from using, that type of ammunition when it comes to protesters. And so they started using pellets. Now, one of the things, as raised by Jasbir is that, there's this idea also of one is that I alluded to it earlier, but it's kind of like when you get shot by a pellet, you are marked, right? And so when you are marked, what that means is that you are, if you go to the hospital to seek attention, you are likely to get arrested. If you are hurt by pellets, you may not get a job. And the society also shuns you. So that is the consequence of being hit by a pellet, not being killed, but also being erased in some ways from a normal member of society. The other thing is that, which is also very interesting, but also disturbing, is that there's also a binary created with regards to, a pellet victim and then the perfect pellet victim. So you have victims or survivors who are perhaps throwing stones or in protests, and they are seen as deviant, and they are totally pushed out of any sort of assistance or any sort of they lose like the moral high ground for taking part in protests. But if you are a young girl or young boy or an old member of the family sitting in a house and you hit by pellets mistakenly, then suddenly you are, you are become the perfect victim, and it totally washes away the fact that 1.3 million pellets were shot during 2016, and just one person was shot in error. So I think that binary that's created also by the mainstream media is also an important factor as well.
I want to go back to a question that Jasbir raised, and I want to redirect it to Rifat, where Jasbir was asking about the medical infrastructure in Kashmir, because she was talking about the medical infrastructure in Gaza in comparison. So would you speak to that a little bit about the medical infrastructure in Kashmir and your experiences of reporting it and experiences of the medical sector there?
I think when it comes to medical infrastructure, there are like lot of issues because if, for instance, there are two tertiary care hospitals, and mostly one SMHS hospital caters to these ophthalmology like issues or like pellet injuries. Mostly, it's catered there, so it's overwhelmed most of the times. Like during these like when there was a civilian uprising, that time it was like overwhelmed. And I think when there is like some advanced treatment, most of the patients like either have to go outside like for treatment, which becomes very costly for them, which becomes unaffordable because they are already burdened by so many things in life. And then this becomes an extra burden to their families, like to go for pellet surgeries or to go like outside the Kashmir. So like or even if they kind of prefer to get treated in Kashmir, they have to like wait like months together for surgeries. And I think delayed treatment has become problem among most of these pellet victims.
I'm so sorry, Fatima.
Go for it.
I didn't answer your question about international law, did I?
No, you didn't.
I mean, I think it's obvious. It's clear that these pellets and the way that they use are in breach of international law. I think that's pretty clear. All directives regarding international law say that all kinds of weaponry are meant to be used. You know, they shouldn't contravene like the principles of proportionality. You know, so any kind of weapon that's used has to fit under the has to apply to war and warlike situations, and you can't be deliberately targeting civilians or using them to maim. So I think, I mean, I don't know what the exact framing is, but I know there's some kind of I think there's a basic principle for the use of force and firearms that clearly talks about that. And I suggest, I mean, I can probably find it and send it over to whoever asked the question. But as far as I know, the disproportionate use of these pellet guns are in contravention of international law.
I want to bring in another audience question, and I'm going to read it out. And it says, COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge opportunity for the fascist state to suppress all protests. How is Kashmir doing now, and what could protests against colonial rule look like now? So maybe the team could go for it. Anyone from the team could go for it. Rifat, do you want to answer that since you're on the ground now?
I think we are currently like under fighting this pandemic, so people are busy with that to save themselves, to stay in their homes.
And has the pandemic, from what we've been seeing and what has been reported in the last few days, has this pandemic also become an opportunity for increased surveillance in the name of law and order?
I think like obviously it has like the pandemic has added to the problems of the people in Kashmir right now. They don't have to, like, you know, in last 1 year so many things have changed. People are in a way yet to come in terms with it. You know, it's like they are not able to understand how to react. They are kind still in shock how to react to the whole situation. And when they were kind of, you know, in the middle of this shock and suddenly this pandemic happened, so you can imagine the chaos in like in the minds of the people, and like how much burdened, you know, they feel with all this right now.
Yeah, and the lockdown is almost going to, the double lockdown is almost now going to be a year old on August 5.
Exactly.
There's another like crowd control specific question with regard to India from the audience, where an audience member asks, can you tell us if this method of crowd control is being used anywhere else in India, or the world for that matter. I know Jasbir spoke about it in terms of Gaza and Palestine. The audience member specifically asks, there have been far more violent protests in India. Maybe Azad, do you want to take this question and talk about why, as the audience member asks, why they haven't used pellet shotguns maybe anywhere else in India?
So I would be lying if I said I don't know why they don't use it in other places, but I can only guess that it's Kashmir in many ways is a very different area. It's we talk about international law. What laws work in Kashmir? You have all kinds of legal mechanisms that protect the armed forces in Kashmir. They basically can do anything in Kashmir. Think about the home demolitions that are taking place right now. If they are hunting down like so-called rebels or militants, whatever you want to call these young men, then they demolish 5, 10 houses at a time, leaving people homeless during a time of COVID. What law? Where else do they do that in India? So, I mean, of course, considering that Kashmir is not part of India, but in terms of the Indian government and their activities elsewhere. You think about human shields that they use in Kashmir as well. So if, in Kashmir, the point is that if a civilian or any Kashmiri is seen as a threat to the state in any way, then the armed forces can basically perform in any direction, and take any measure that they seem or deem appropriate. Now, in terms of where else pellets are used, recently they were used in Chile during the protests there. I saw a report a couple of days ago that they were used, but different types of pellets were used in the US itself. And they use pellets, they use rubber pellets. And so someone was hurt in the eye during a protest, but they managed to save the person's eyesight because the pellet was a little bit different. So yes, this is the kind of thing that is spreading. This kind of impunity is spreading. Jasbir mentions or asks that question about, like, is it a case of, do these states have to, follow laws or follow anything anymore? And the answer is, I mean, it doesn't seem like it. When you think about the similarities between India and how they operate in Kashmir and how Israel operates in occupied territories and in Gaza, the similarities are very, 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 very clear, even to the naked eye. When it comes to this maiming, when it comes to surveillance, and a lot of these nations, a lot of these countries are borrowing from each other now. So if pellets are used in the US, I mean, they learned it from someone else, and because so many countries and so many states are becoming so embroiled in terms of like pushing towards like a right-wing kind of like authoritarian agenda, then it becomes even harder for anyone to actually speak out against another state because they're doing the precise thing as the next door neighbor, So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, the pellets are being used in other places.
I'm going to return to Jasbir and ask this another audience question, which is about the kind of recourses that people have to draw attention to this in terms of, since you've seen the use of pellet guns, and in your book you talk about this kind of maiming against protesters in the US, also in Israel, Palestine, because there have been some kind of campaigns and people's driven movements. So would you be able to speak to these modes of recourses that people and communities might have and that you may have seen or researched on?
Yeah, some of that is a kind of forthcoming, research and work that I'm doing, mostly in the right to maim. I'm tracing logics of and the illogics of state violence, unfortunately. But I will say that a kind of complicated nexus is kind of disability rights platforms and the NGO and humanitarian aid network, because it's both solicits an audience that's watching and looking for, I think Azad brought it up, the kind of perfect victim or the injured body that can be in some ways respectable or rehabilitated enough to be a disabled subject. And so there is, there is that interface between disability rights organizations and NGOs and the possibility of that visibility through that kind of rehabilitation. But obviously it comes at such a great cost in some ways, because it's really about understanding disability in one very, very, particular way. And in the same sense, the humanitarian aid networks are compromised because they have to transit through Israel in order to have access to the occupied West Bank and in order to have access to Gaza. So there are some organizations that are doing disaster capitalist intervention. Doctors Without Borders has been there for quite some time. And so, the results of that are again kind of mixed. On the community level, I think one of the interesting things that's been happening in Gaza as well as the West Bank is that because of the forms of mobility restriction and containment, there was an expectation that once COVID, showed up, it would spread very quickly, and it wouldn't. There wouldn't be a kind of porosity around its transit. It would just be kind of enclosed in this very small space. But the rates of infection were quite low, actually, in both places, and it remains to be seen whether or not that the rates kind of continue to be low. But it does seem like there's an infrastructure there of kind of community care and of alternatives to medical infrastructure and alternatives to relying on state care because there isn't any state care. So I think that's something to kind of think about and research or think more about how people are creating kind of alternative mutual aid or care networks that don't rely on the kind of spectacle of maiming. So when the Great March started 2.5 years ago, there was so many images of injured Gazan protesters, predominantly men, either with crutches or amputated, right? And so what are the alternatives to that kind of visibility? That would be the real kind of question.
On this idea of community-driven care, I want to bring in Rifat and ask you this question. Earlier, you mentioned something about the Pellet Victims Association and how pellet victim survivors have gotten together to think about and talk about their issues and organize around their issues. Rifat, could you speak a little bit more about how they got together and how they've been organizing?
I think it's a group of pellet victims. So they came together and they created this Pellet Victims Association Kashmir. And so they kind of, in all the districts of Kashmir, they kind of did a little bit of, they gathered people like them and they came together. So what they do is they kind of help each other. Like if someone needs to, study, if someone needs support for education. So by like little ways they try to help each other, and also they are coming together to kind of become each other's support, because a lot of these people need assistance, they need psychiatric help, because you must have read that a lot of these people, when they are when they are injured and slowly they find themselves caught up in this mental trauma, because suddenly they find their lives changed altogether. Like if someone was a student, he finds himself in a different world. If someone was doing some normal work, it kind of a sudden darkness falls on their lives, and they find themselves in the middle of a chaos and where their lives change forever. So what in this association, because when I was doing research for this film, so that's how I came across this association. So I interviewed some of these girls are also part of it, so I interviewed them. That's how I came to know about it. And because a lot of these people, some people find themselves in more difficult situations, so they kind of counsel each other, because when they see the other person is suffering from the same pain, it gives them a little bit of, they get a little bit of relief, or they get a little bit of support from the other person.
Thank you. That's really powerful. Horia, I have a question for you. Would you be able to talk a little bit about the responses to the documentary and what kind of audience responses or responses from various quarters you've gotten to this coverage on Kashmir specifically?
Okay, I mean, well, there's the kind of internal responses, which has been very positive. A lot of my colleagues were very, for want of a better word, excited to see such a personal story come out of Kashmir. Excuse me. And so I think everyone just kind of got together and really tried to make it work. After we edited the general body of the documentary together and we were happy with the structure, Azad reached out to the EP of a digital documentary strand called Close Up on Al Jazeera. And the EP of that, Andrew Phillips, watched the film and he was really moved by it. And he really worked very, very hard to get it on the channel, or at least on the digital platforms. So once we got it online, the response, I mean, we were a bit worried, about the response, because I think anything about Kashmir, immediately you've got these troll armies that descend on any kind of content about Kashmir. So I think part of us was quite nervous about the response and whether it would be hijacked by these kind of internet trolls. But actually, the response has been really positive. I think people have been really moved by Farzan's story, and I also think it's a story that not many people are used to seeing in that way in Kashmir. So that alone. Even though I know that Azad and Rifat keep saying this is our kind of small effort, it's not a small effort. it's a big deal that we managed to get this story out, and I think people have really appreciated that.
There's more questions from the audience in terms of how can people shed more light on this topic internationally, and people are asking what are some credible resources or references that people could turn to learn more about this issue. Would any of you from the team want to answer that?
Sure, I'll take that. So one of the things is that Amnesty International has on a number of occasions organized campaigns about these pellets. So I think, the first and easiest thing to do is to perhaps write to them, to pressurize them to keep on raising this issue. The second thing is that the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, I think they need to be made aware of this issue as much as possible as well. And I think this is a start, right? The third thing is that this organization that's partnering with the People's Forum today, Stand for Kashmir, also has a lot of resources on their site and a lot of links and experts on their website that you could follow and watch with regards to where this discussion is going and what kinds of things are happening there. And I think that's the first part, right? And Al Jazeera, although I'm not on Al Jazeera anymore, but Al Jazeera covers these stories closely. And you can also look at some of the Indian media like The Wire and Scroll, who are also covering this. So I think keeping abreast of what's going on is important, and speaking to some of the people who are, trying to raise this awareness is also, I guess, the least that people can do. Yeah, I mean, Rifat, do you have anything to add to this?
I think a lot has been written, lot of stories have been done, and I think also Amnesty International has come with a lot of reports. They have specifically come up with a report where they have profiled personal stories of 89 pellet victims, including Insha and others. So I think people can refer to those things to get more knowledge about it.
I also want to turn this question to Jasbir. Would you recommend any references or sources which covers this transnationally, where like what you've explained in your book about community-driven protests and community-driven organizing around this question of maiming?
Well, two things. I mean, one place to read up on is the history of the refugee camps in Palestine, because many of them, started their own, health centers and disability centers and community-based, medical care and resources in response to the first Intifada, and how many people were injured during the first Intifada. It's a kind of vast number, especially knee injuries and lower leg injuries. So there's that history that's really rich. And I often get asked, like, well, what is disability activist or disability justice organizing? What is it in Palestine? And I think, well, actually these centers were the first kind of community-based responses to what was happening around maiming, and don't get enough kind of credit for that, or they get seen as kind of technical as opposed to kind of activist or political. So there's that. The second thing that I've been finding incredibly inspiring is just when these incidents kind of come to be known on social media, and whatever you think of the obvious limits of social media, but when the Palestinian journalist was shot in the eye, I think this was about a year ago, you started seeing, and this was also in concert with what was going on in Chile, you started seeing pictures of people posing with their eye covered with their hand or with a patch or with a book. And so there's this kind of symbolic economy around exposing maiming for what it is, which is, it's not accidental, it's intentional. And there's a kind of refusal to swallow this humanitarian narrative about how one is being not killed, right? And kind of returning the visual of maiming back to the maimers in some sense. So I think that, I hope and I think, and that those images went viral. And I think that kind of exposure and refusal to participate in this humanitarian discourse of at least you're still alive is part of a kind of global, solidarity response, or acting in solidarity. And it was very moving to see, school children in classrooms with their books covering one eye, photos of that from Palestine.
In fact, in 2016, which was quite a painful summer in Kashmir, there was a similar campaign where people had created these images of celebrities and used digitally named those pictures, and that was a big campaign. I just want to quickly add a note in terms of references on reading up more about this issue within Kashmir. That's knowledge produced by the local human rights and civil liberties organizations like EPDP and JKCCS, and their reports and various publications are available on their websites. Last question, and I want to take this to Rifat. First, actually two questions. First is, can you speak to, I know you've already spoken about the organizing, but there has been an audience question about rehabilitation of the pellet survivors. And second, can you tell us if you know what Farzan is up to now?
I think about rehabilitation, there is no like specific rehabilitation facility for the pellet victims. People are like struggling in their individual ways and trying to help themselves, or their families trying to help them. Farzan, like obviously because this is a lockdown, he had like he's running his own shop currently, and like he's helping his family, trying to help his family, and he's continuing his education as well. He doesn't go to school because schools are shut right now, but he is trying to study as well.
And there's a very powerful line at the end where he says, "You've got to try."
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. We're at the end of questions from our audience, and we're almost done with our allotted time. And I want to ask the panel if we have any quick comments, wrap-up comments before we wrap up and log off. Anybody would like to add any concluding thoughts?
Sure. Because I obviously haven't spoken enough. I think there's something to say about this question of boycott. And this company, ordnance factories, I think if people really want to, make a dent, right? Writing to Amnesty, writing to the UN and stuff is nice. But the real thing here is that we've got to make it clear to these organizations, to these companies, that this kind of weaponry and this kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated. And to do that, people need to trace which companies or countries are buying from this company, ordnance factories, and they've got to write into their, to their political leadership or to the companies that are purchasing these things from this Indian company, and to kind of like somehow force them to reconsider. The path that India is taking and has been on for the past number of years, it's only getting more and more emboldened. It's unlikely to change its course. This didn't start with Modi, and it's likely to continue. There's a type of ethnic cleansing that's underway now in Kashmir. And so pellets are just one aspect of that. And so just as you have the BDS campaign with regards to Palestine and trying to pressurize Israel to end the occupation, I think some kind of pressure needs to be put on India and put on these companies as well. So I think that's my final point.
Thank you for that note of and call of action, Azad. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us for this live stream today, and for all our panelists for giving us their expert perspectives and for increasing our perspectives and giving us more on what's been going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.